flight attendant humiliated LeBron James and demanded that he leave first class. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. LeBron James stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the brim of his plain navy blue baseball cap. The reflection staring back at him was almost unrecognizable, even to himself. Gone were the designer suits and the unmistakable aura of an NBA superstar. Instead, he wore a simple gray hoodie, loose-fitting jeans, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. Oversized sunglasses concealed his eyes, and a black face mask covered the lower half of his face. He hoped the disguise would be enough to grant him the anonymity he craved. Motivational. For years, LeBron had been under the relentless gaze of the public eye. Every move scrutinized, every gesture analyzed. The constant attention was suffocating. He longed for a moment of normalcy, a chance to experience the world without the weight of his fame pressing down on him. That's when he made the decision to take a commercial flight. First class, of course, but still a significant departure from the private jets he was accustomed to. As he made his way through the bustling corridors of Los Angeles International Airport, LeBron couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia. The cacophony of rolling suitcases, the muffled announcements over the PA system, the mingling scents of fast food and jet fuel. It all reminded him of his early days, before the championships, before the accolades, back when he was just a kid with a dream, navigating airports like any other traveler. People brushed past him without a second glance. Some were engrossed in their phones, others wrangling restless children or balancing overpriced coffees. A security officer gave him a cursory look, but seemed more interested in the beeping metal detector than in LeBron's towering frame. It was both liberating and unsettling to move through the world unnoticed. Approaching the gate, he handed his boarding pass to the attendant. She scanned it mechanically, her eyes never meeting his. "Enjoy your flight," she said flatly, already turning her attention to the next passenger. LeBron shrugged it off and walked down the jet bridge, the familiar hum of the airplane growing louder with each step. Stepping onto the plane, he was greeted by a flight attendant who offered a polite but distant nod. Her name tag read Susan. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she gestured vaguely toward the first-class cabin. "Seats are to your left," she said curtly. LeBron noticed the shift in her demeanor almost immediately when the passenger behind him, a well-dressed man in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "Welcome aboard, sir. Can I offer you a glass of champagne?" she beamed. LeBron found his seat, a window seat with ample legroom, and settled in. He placed his backpack under the seat in front of him and gazed out the window, watching the maze of ground crew vehicles zigzagging across the tarmac. Minutes passed, and passengers continued to board. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, offering drinks and assisting with overhead luggage, yet not one approached him. He watched as a young couple across the aisle was served glasses of sparkling wine. An older woman a few rows ahead received a plush blanket and a pillow without even asking. A businessman diagonally from him was offered a selection of newspapers and magazines. LeBron raised an eyebrow but remained silent. Maybe they were just getting to him, last. As the plane filled up, the seat beside him remained empty until a portly man in a pinstripe suit appeared. The man looked at his boarding pass, then at the seat number, and finally at LeBron. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Excuse me," he said tersely, squeezing past LeBron without waiting for him to stand. He settled into his seat with a huff, adjusting his gold cufflinks and smoothing out his tie. LeBron offered a polite nod, but the man avoided eye contact. Moments later, Susan approached their row, her smile returning. "Mr. Whitman, so lovely to see you again," she gushed. "Will you be having your usual pre-fleet drink?" "Yes, thank you. Scotch on the rocks," Mr. Whitman replied, casting a sidelong glance at LeBron. "And for you, sir?" Susan asked, her eyes never drifting toward LeBron. "Nothing for now," Whitman said dismissively, waving her off. LeBron cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me," he began, his voice muffled by the mask. Susan turned to him with a hint of impatience. Yes? Could I get a bottle of water, please? She gave a tight-lipped smile. We'll be serving beverages after takeoff, she replied curtly before walking away. Mr. Whitman chuckled under his breath. They let just about anyone in first class these days, he muttered, ensuring LeBron could hear. LeBron felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, a mix of irritation and disappointment. He had been judged and underestimated before, long before fame had shielded him from such prejudices. Taking a deep breath, he reminded himself why he had taken this flight. To experience life as everyone else did, for better or worse. The cabin lights dimmed as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their impending departure. Flight attendants performed the safety demonstrations with practiced smiles. LeBron fastened his seatbelt, glancing once more around the cabin. The atmosphere felt exclusive in the worst way, oppressive rather than luxurious. As the plane taxied to the runway, he closed his eyes, hoping to find some solace in anonymity. But the whispers and sideways glances from other passengers were hard to ignore. He could feel their judgments, their assumptions layering upon him like an invisible cloak. The engines roared to life and the plane ascended into the sky. City lights blurred into a mosaic of luminescence before disappearing into the cloud cover. LeBron had wanted to escape the weight of his fame. Instead, he had stumbled upon an even heavier burden, the weight of being unseen. The portly man in a pinstriped suit appeared, glancing at his boarding pass before looking at the seat number, then finally at LeBron. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Excuse me," he said tersely, squeezing past LeBron without waiting for him to stand. The man settled into his seat with a huff, adjusting his gold cufflinks and smoothing out his tie. LeBron offered a polite nod, but the man avoided eye contact altogether. Moments later, Susan, the flight attendant, approached their row. Her smile brightened instantly as she turned to the man beside LeBron. "Mr. Whitman, so lovely to see you again," she gushed, her voice dripping with warmth. "Will you be having your usual pre-flight?" "Yes, thank you. Scotch on the rocks," Mr. Whitman replied smoothly, casting a sidelong glance at LeBron. Susan nodded before turning slightly, her expression cooling. "And for you, sir?" she asked. But she wasn't looking at LeBron. Her eyes remained fixed on Whitman, as if LeBron didn't exist. Before LeBron could answer, Whitman waved a dismissive hand. "Nothing for now," he said, speaking on LeBron's behalf. LeBron cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he began, his voice muffled slightly by the mask. Susan turned to him with a hint of impatience. "Yes? Could I get a bottle of water, please?" he asked, his voice even and polite. Susan gave a tight-lipped smile, her posture stiff. "We'll be serving beverages after takeoff," she replied curtly before turning on her heel and walking away. Whitman chuckled under his breath, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "They let just about anyone in first class these days," he muttered, not subtly at all, ensuring LeBron could hear. LeBron felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, a mix of irritation and disappointment. He had been here before. Long before fame shielded him from such prejudices, he had experienced the same condescending tone, the same dismissiveness, the same quiet rejection. He inhaled deeply, reminding himself why he had taken this flight, to experience life as everyone else did, for better or worse. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their impending departure. Flight attendants performed the safety demonstrations with practiced smiles. LeBron fastened his seatbelt, glancing around the cabin. The atmosphere was thick, not just with exclusivity, but with an unspoken hierarchy. As the plane taxied to the runway, LeBron closed his eyes, hoping to find solace in the anonymity he had sought. But the whispers and sideways glances from other passengers were impossible to ignore. He could feel the weight of their judgments, assumptions, layering upon him like an invisible cloak. The engines roared and the plane ascended into the sky. Below, The city lights blurred into a mosaic of luminescence before vanishing into the cloud cover. Once the seatbelt sign flicked off, Susan and the other flight attendants sprang into action, moving through the aisle with drinks and snacks. A different flight attendant, a young man with a friendly demeanor, approached their row. "Would you care for a beverage?" he asked. "Another scotch?" Whitman replied without looking up from his newspaper. The attendant turned to LeBron. "And for you, sir?" LeBron opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, Susan intercepted. "I've got this, Jeremy," she said sharply. Jeremy raised an eyebrow but stepped back. "Actually, I was just—" LeBron started. "Sir, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be serving beverages shortly," Susan interrupted, her tone leaving no room for discussion. LeBron leaned back in his seat, biting back his frustration. This was more than inattentiveness. It felt deliberate. His eyes followed Susan as she continued down the aisle, her demeanor warm and accommodating with every other passenger but him. "Unbelievable," he murmured to himself. Whitman smirked. "You know, if you're not comfortable up here, there's no shame in moving to another cabin," he said, swirling his drink. LeBron turned to look at him directly. "I'm fine where I am, thank you," he replied, his tone measured. Whitman shrugged. "Suit yourself." LeBron stared out the window into the dark expanse beyond the clouds. In trying to escape the trappings of fame, he had uncovered a different kind of visibility, one that made him a target of subtle disdain rather than adulation. Time passed slowly. The in-flight movie held no appeal, and sleep seemed impossible. Reaching into his backpack, LeBron pulled out a notebook and pen. Writing had always been a therapeutic outlet, a way to process his thoughts away from the noise of the world. He began jotting down his observations. The flight attendant's dismissive behavior, the contempt from his seatmate, the way other passengers seemed to unite in silent judgment. Each sentence felt like a catharsis. Then, a soft voice beside him broke his concentration. "Excuse me." LeBron looked up to see Jeremy, the friendly flight attendant. "I thought you might like a bottle of water," he said quietly, handing it to him discreetly. A genuine smile spread beneath LeBron's mask. "Thank you," he replied sincerely. Jeremy nodded. "Let me know if you need anything else." As Jeremy walked away, LeBron felt a glimmer of hope. Not everyone subscribed to the same narrow-mindedness he had been subjected to since boarding the plane. The rest of the flight continued without incident, but the earlier interactions lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this experience was emblematic of a larger truth. This wasn't just his story. It was the story of countless others. People who never got the chance to remove a mask and change perceptions. As the plane continued its journey, LeBron sat back and let the realization settle. The world wasn't just watching him, he was watching it too. And what he saw was a reality that needed to change. The issue of prejudice, a pervasive tendency to judge others based on superficial criteria, lingered in LeBron's mind as the plane began its descent. The cabin buzzed with the familiar sounds of passengers preparing for arrival, seatbacks clicking upright, laptops being stowed away, and conversations picking up as phones regained signal. As they touched down, LeBron felt a mixture of relief and resolve. This journey had been more than just a flight. It had been a revelation. Despite his status shielding him from much of the world's harsh realities, this experience had confirmed something he had long known. The underlying prejudices still existed for countless others who couldn't simply remove a mask to alter perceptions. As the plane taxied to the gate, Susan, the flight attendant, made her customary announcements, her voice lacking the warmth and charm typically extended to first-class passengers. LeBron gathered his belongings, slipping his notebook into his backpack, reflecting on everything that had transpired. "Well, this was enlightening," Mr. Whitman remarked sarcastically, adjusting his tie. LeBron looked at him thoughtfully. "Indeed, it was." Passengers began to disembark, and LeBron waited patiently for his turn. As he moved toward the exit, he caught sight of Jeremy, the friendly flight attendant who had quietly shown him kindness earlier. Their eyes met, and Jeremy gave him a subtle nod. LeBron returned the gesture, a small but genuine acknowledgement of the moment. Stepping into the terminal, LeBron removed his sunglasses and lowered his mask, taking a deep breath of the unfamiliar air of anonymity. One last time. The bustling crowd moved around him, each person absorbed in their own world, unaware of the quiet storm he had just weathered. But LeBron was no longer just an observer. He was now a participant, awakened to realities that many face daily. As he walked toward baggage claim, he knew this experience was not just an isolated event. It was a call to shine a light on the shadows cast by prejudice, and to use his voice where it truly mattered. LeBron had hoped that as the flight settled into its routine, the discomfort of the previous moments would dissipate. But the tension in the cabin remained, thick and unnerving. His seatmate, Mr. Whitman, seemed determined to make him feel every bit of that tension. LeBron leaned back in his seat, trying to ignore the weight of unspoken judgment pressing down on him. The low hum of the engines filled the space around him, a distant backdrop to the murmurs, the clinking of glasses and the rustling of papers. It all felt so far away, as if he was no longer fully present in the world around him. This wasn't a new sensation for him. He had felt it before. In locker rooms, on the court, in high-end restaurants, and at social gatherings where eyes would narrow at his presence, questioning whether he truly belonged. But today the feeling cut deeper. Mr. Whitman, his seatmate, had settled in comfortably, spreading his legs wide, taking up more space than the seat required. LeBron could feel his every movement, the subtle brushing of Whitman's elbow against his side each time he reached for his drink or adjusted his briefcase. Every small shift reminded LeBron of how confined the space was, how deliberate the man's passive aggression seemed. "Sorry about that," Whitman muttered, though his tone lacked sincerity as he nudged LeBron yet again. Then, with a half-hearted chuckle, he added, "Guess these seats are a bit tight for someone your size." His voice carried a condescending lilt, as though it was meant to be an inside joke, except LeBron wasn't laughing. His grip tightened around the armrest. He didn't react, didn't rise to the bait, but the edge of irritation began to simmer just beneath the surface. Years in the spotlight had taught him the power of restraint, how to absorb disrespect without reacting. But sometimes, just sometimes, it felt impossible to suppress the rising tide of frustration. A few minutes passed in tense silence, punctuated only by the clinking of glassware and the hushed movements of the flight attendants bustling down the aisle. LeBron's mind began to drift. For a moment he retreated into memory, his thoughts drifting back to childhood, to the early days when he was just a kid in Akron, struggling to find his place in a world that too often overlooked him. Back then it wasn't about basketball. It was about proving he was just as capable as anyone else. And yet even now, after all his fame and success, the judgment never truly went away. It had just taken a different form. Whitman shifted again, this time pressing his knee against LeBron's leg. A subtle invasion of space, yet deliberate enough to make LeBron uncomfortable. LeBron exhaled slowly, willing himself to let it go. But when Whitman refused to adjust, LeBron finally spoke. "Hey, do you mind?" His voice was quiet but firm. Whitman blinked, feigning surprise, as if he hadn't noticed his intrusion. "Oh, sorry," he muttered, shifting slightly without a second thought. LeBron felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing more. There was no point in engaging further. He had learned that people like Whitman, people who wielded passive condescension as a weapon, didn't change their attitudes easily. And LeBron didn't have the energy to teach someone a lesson today. He just wanted to make it through this flight, to land and to leave behind the discomfort of this entire experience. But as he stared out the window, the darkness stretching endlessly before him, he knew he couldn't just forget what had happened. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, not because of their actions, but because of their appearance, their background, their very existence. The flight continued, but LeBron's mind remained elsewhere, lost in the weight of what this moment truly meant. And he knew without a doubt that he had a responsibility, not just as LeBron James the athlete, but as LeBron James the man who had seen the world for what it really was. And now he had to decide what to do with that truth. When LeBron was just a young kid in Akron, he struggled to fit in, facing a world that too often overlooked him because of the color of his skin. It hadn't always been about basketball. It was about proving to people that he was just as capable as anyone else. But even now, with all his fame and success, the judgment never seemed to fully disappear. It had just taken a different shape. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Everything all right over there?" LeBron turned to see Mr. Whitman looking at him, his voice laced with forced politeness. The smile he offered seemed like an afterthought, lacking any real sincerity. His eyes avoided direct contact, instead fixing somewhere above LeBron's head, as if he was trying to convince himself that he was being courteous while still making it clear that he saw himself as superior. LeBron nodded curtly, forcing a smile that felt completely out of place. "Yeah, just fine." The tension in the air thickened. The situation was absurd. LeBron James, one of the most recognizable athletes in the world, sitting in disguise, trying to pass as just another passenger, yet still the subject of subtle disdain and discomfort. For a brief moment, a part of him was tempted to tell Whitman exactly who he was, to rip off the mask, expose the truth, and watch the man's face change when he realized he had been sitting next to a legend. But that wouldn't change anything. The problem wasn't that people didn't know who he was. It was that they couldn't see past their own biases. Just then, Susan, the flight attendant who had ignored him earlier, appeared again, but this time she wore a bright smile as she approached Whitman. "Mr. Whitman, I see you've already gotten comfortable. Can I offer you something else to drink?" she asked, her voice dripping with the kind of warmth and familiarity that LeBron had yet to receive. Whitman raised his now nearly empty glass. "Another scotch on the rocks." "Of course, sir," Susan nodded, bowing her head slightly before turning to walk away. For a split second she glanced at LeBron, but her expression barely changed. She said nothing, no greeting, no acknowledgement, no offer of service. The slight was almost too subtle to be intentional, but to LeBron it was as sharp as a blade. He watched as Susan continued down the aisle, stopping to serve the other first-class passengers. She greeted each one by name, offered them drinks, and made polite small talk, all while completely ignoring him. A familiar knot formed in his stomach, a mix of frustration and disappointment. He had been on enough flights to know how first-class service worked. It was supposed to be impeccable, attentive, and accommodating. Instead, here he was, sitting unnoticed and unacknowledged, as if he didn't even belong in the seat he had paid for. His frustration simmered, but instead of confronting Susan or demanding an explanation, he kept his silence. There was no point. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. The weight of his own fame made people uncomfortable, and he didn't want to be the cause of someone else's unease. As the flight dragged on, each minute felt longer than the last. LeBron tried to distract himself, flipping through the notes he had scribbled earlier, but his thoughts kept drifting back, first to Susan, then to Whitman, to the snide comments, the dismissive behavior. It was all too familiar. A microcosm of the larger world he had spent his entire life trying to navigate. People saw him, but they didn't see him. They saw the image, the public persona, the celebrity, but not the person behind it. Whitman, seemingly content with his drink, shifted in his seat again. This time his knee pressed against LeBron's leg. A subtle but deliberate invasion of space. LeBron tensed. He had let a lot go on this flight, but something about this final intrusion was too much. He turned to Whitman, his voice calm but firm. "Do you mind?" Whitman blinked, acting as if he hadn't noticed. "Oh, sorry," he muttered dismissively, shifting away without a second thought. LeBron clenched his jaw but said nothing more. There was no point in engaging any further. He had learned from experience that men like Whitman, people who believed their quiet condescension wasn't obvious, never saw themselves as the problem. All LeBron could do now was breathe, refocus, and wait for the flight to end. He turned toward the window, watching the clouds roll past, but his mind refused to quiet. It wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about a single flight attendant ignoring a black man in first class. It wasn't just about a seatmate making snide remarks. This was about something bigger. It was about the way people like him were perceived, judged before they had a chance to prove anything, dismissed based on nothing more than assumptions. It was about the millions of people who experience this kind of treatment every single day, who didn't have the privilege of wealth, status, or fame to shield them. LeBron had worked his entire life to be more than what the world expected him to be. But no matter how much he had accomplished, some people would always reduce him to a stereotype. The engines hummed steadily as the flight continued, but inside LeBron's mind, there was no peace. This moment, this frustrating, disheartening experience, wasn't just a personal slight. It was a lesson, a reminder, and when this plane landed, he wouldn't forget it. LeBron felt the pressure of Whitman's knee against his own, a subtle invasion of space, but enough to make him uncomfortable. At first, he tried to ignore it, shifting slightly in his seat. But the longer it went on, the more it gnawed at him. Finally, he exhaled and spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Hey, do you mind?" Whitman blinked, caught off guard by the sudden request. He looked down at his knee, which was still lightly pressing against LeBron's leg. "Oh, sorry," he muttered dismissively, shifting away without a second thought. LeBron felt his jaw tighten, but he didn't say anything more. There was no point in engaging any further. He had long since learned that people like Whitman didn't change their attitudes easily, and he certainly didn't have the energy to teach anyone a lesson today. All he wanted was to get through this flight, land, and leave behind the discomfort that had been thrust upon him. And yet, despite his efforts to brush it off, something kept him from fully letting go of his frustration. A thought lingered at the back of his mind, an idea that refused to be ignored. This wasn't just about him. At this moment, he wasn't just LeBron James, the world-renowned athlete. He was anyone who had ever been judged unfairly based on their appearance, background, economic status, or race. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about a single flight or a single encounter. It was about something much bigger. But that revelation didn't make the journey any easier. As the plane continued its course, LeBron found himself wishing for something simple: to experience life just once as an ordinary person. No cameras, no expectations, no prejudices. Instead, he had to confront the uncomfortable truth. No matter how much he tried to escape it, he would always be viewed through the lens of who people thought he was, not who he actually was. The flight dragged on, the hours passing in an agonizingly slow rhythm. The silence between him and Whitman thickened, heavy with unspoken thoughts. LeBron gazed out the window, watching as the clouds stretched endlessly below them. He couldn't help but wonder, how many others had felt this same sting of being seen but not truly seen? How many people had experienced the judgment he was facing now, not because of anything they had done, but simply because of who they were? The rhythmic hum of the engines filled the cabin, a low and constant background noise. Around him, the quiet chatter of passengers, the clinking of glasses, and the rustling of papers continued, but none of it felt real. The entire experience felt distant, as if he were both the actor and the spectator in a performance he never agreed to be part of. The tension had only grown since takeoff, and LeBron could feel it in the way people moved around him, or rather, in the way they avoided him. He could feel it in Whitman's rigid posture, in the way the flight attendants barely acknowledged his presence, in the occasional glance thrown his way that lingered just a second too long. It wasn't that they knew who he was, it was how they saw him. The very essence of his identity had been erased. No longer LeBron James, NBA superstar, no longer an athlete, a philanthropist, or a man whose career had been built on discipline and perseverance. In their eyes, he was simply a black man in a hoodie, wearing a mask. Someone whose presence was immediately read through the prism of suspicion and stereotype. He had been through this before. This was the quiet prejudice. The kind that didn't make headlines, the kind that wasn't loud or overt, yet was just as damaging. The cold shoulders, the unnecessary delays in service, the way people unconsciously pulled away when he got too close. It wasn't new, but that didn't make it hurt any less. He had hoped just for a moment that on this flight he could escape it, that by making himself invisible he could finally experience peace, a brief taste of normalcy. But it seemed that even in disguise he was still the object of unwanted scrutiny. As the flight continued, LeBron felt his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He could feel it rising, pressing against his composure, demanding to be acknowledged. But he had spent years learning how to harness that kind of energy, how to channel it into something more constructive. Taking a deep breath, he picked up his phone and opened the recording app. His thumb hovered over the record button. This wasn't something he usually did. LeBron had never been the type to broadcast every injustice or every slight. He didn't believe in chasing outrage for the sake of it. But today felt different. Today it felt important. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't about feeling slighted or overlooked. It was about how people like him, people who didn't fit the mold, were treated every single day. People who, like him, were judged before they even had a chance to speak. People who were perceived as something they were not. The world had a way of making people feel small, of forcing them to question whether they belonged, whether they mattered. LeBron had spent his entire life proving that he did. But what about the millions of others who didn't have his platform, his visibility, or his resources? He had to do something, anything, to make this injustice seen. He tapped the record button, setting his phone in his lap and angling the camera discreetly toward the aisle. His seatmate, Mr. Whitman, was now deep in conversation with Susan, the flight attendant, and a few other passengers around them. LeBron already knew that whatever they were saying wouldn't be kind. He could see it in their eyes, the way they avoided him, the way their conversation became livelier when they spoke among themselves, but never once included him. His finger hovered over the phone screen, adjusting the angle to ensure he captured everything without drawing attention to the fact that he was recording. As he sat in silence, his senses sharpened. He noticed everything. The way the flight attendants floated down the aisle, their light smiles stretched too thin, their attention carefully diverted everywhere except toward him. Susan passed by, her eyes flicking to him for just a second before quickly darting away. She was busy with Whitman, who was now in the middle of an animated retelling of some business meeting in New York. LeBron could see the others leaning in, hanging onto Whitman's every word, nodding and laughing in all the right places. But not once did anyone acknowledge LeBron's presence. It was this stark contrast that struck him the most. The casual, effortless friendliness extended to everyone else while he remained on the periphery, as if he wasn't even there. His humanity stripped away, reduced to nothing more than a shadow in their world. It was the same kind of microaggression he had experienced throughout his life, in school, in restaurants, even in the NBA. But somehow, this felt worse. Somehow, the quiet dismissal, the subtle neglect, felt more suffocating than outright hostility. As if the act of being invisible was even more painful than being openly mistreated. He let the recording run for a few more moments, documenting this silent, unspoken truth. Then, just as he was about to stop, something caught his attention. A few rows ahead, an older woman glanced back at him. Her gaze lingered, a little too long, a little too curious. But it wasn't the kind of curiosity that made someone feel seen. It was the kind that made you feel like a specimen on display. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Then, as if realizing she had been caught, she quickly turned away, shifting in her seat like she had just looked at something she wasn't supposed to see. LeBron felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. He was used to being observed, studied, even idolized, but never truly seen. At this moment, he wasn't a person to these people. He was a curiosity, a riddle wrapped in a hoodie, a mask, and a pair of sunglasses. The plane began its climb into the higher reaches of the sky, but with each passing minute, LeBron could feel something else. The isolation deepening. The moments of connection were few and fleeting, and even those were slipping away. His seatmates' indifference, the flight attendants' pointed avoidance, the passengers' silent judgments, they all added to the weight pressing down on him. LeBron knew the feeling well, and yet somehow, this time, it stung more than usual. The man hadn't said a word to him since that initial elbow bump and the dismissive comment about his size. LeBron took a deep breath, refocusing. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the slight he had suffered in this moment. It was about the millions of people who face this every day, ignored, judged, and underestimated because of how they looked or where they came from. It was about the systemic issues that ran through every aspect of society, from schools to workplaces, from airports to airplanes. The way people were treated differently because of their skin color, their socioeconomic status, or even their accent. The way people were labeled before they ever had a chance to prove who they were. LeBron couldn't change all of that in one flight, but this small act of recording, of documenting the discomfort, the prejudice, the biases, could make a difference. It wasn't about confronting every injustice in the moment. It was about opening a door, a window for the world to see what was happening when they weren't looking. He glanced down at his phone, checking the video. It was raw, unfiltered, a small glimpse into the microaggressions that so many people endured every day. He knew that once the video was out there, it would make people uncomfortable. It would stir up conversations, force people to confront the biases they didn't even know they had. And that was the first step. For now, he kept the phone in his lap, the recording still running. There was nothing to do but observe, to let the uncomfortable truth unfold. He wasn't just a passenger on this plane. He was a witness to something far greater, and he would make sure that others saw it too. The final stretch of the flight was always the most excruciating. As the plane cruised at altitude, the hours dragged by in a muted haze. A sense of slow-moving inertia settled over the cabin. For LeBron, it was a combination of internal tension and external restraint. The deeper his mind sank into the swirling whirlpool of thoughts, about the microaggressions, about the people on board, about everything he had recorded, the heavier he felt. The weight of being a silent observer pressed down on him. But something else was gnawing at him. Something that had been building since the first moment of discomfort. The need to be seen, not as a famous athlete, not as a public figure, as a person, a human being, the real LeBron James. Not the version filtered through headlines, TV shows, or social media. His whole life he had lived in the glare of the spotlight, surrounded by cameras and microphones, but it wasn't the same. No matter how many awards he won, no matter how many accolades were heaped upon him, there was always a distance, a gap between who he was and how he was perceived. People knew the name, but they didn't know the man. And that was the real problem. In a world where you could be anyone, you still weren't seen. As the flight entered its final leg, LeBron felt his agitation growing. The confrontation, subtle as it had been, settled him more than he wanted to admit. The casual way Susan had ignored him. The way Whitman had spoken down to him. The way everyone else seemed completely unaware of what had just taken place. LeBron stared out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly across the sky, a soft, unbroken expanse of white. But beneath them, down on the ground, was a world still deeply divided. A world that still refused to see people like him for who they really were. She had prioritized everyone else on the plane. It wasn't personal, but it stung just the same. No, it wasn't about Susan or the others. It was about the principle, the feeling that even in the supposed safety of anonymity, even in the supposed comfort of his first-class seat, he was still the outsider. His fingers drummed lightly against the armrest, his knuckles flexing as he tried to keep his anger in check. He had been quiet long enough. It was time to stop being passive, to stop letting the world dictate his place. He needed to show them who he was. And he didn't mean just taking off his mask. That was only the surface. He needed them to see the layers beneath it all. He needed them to understand, not as a basketball player, but as a human being. A man who had experienced prejudice, who had fought his entire life to be more than the sum of his circumstances. LeBron sat up straighter in his seat and glanced around the cabin. The passengers, including Mr. Whitman, were either lost in their own worlds or locked in hushed conversations. The flight attendants had resumed their usual duties, though Susan was still avoiding him, barely looking in his direction as she moved through the aisles. LeBron knew it was time. He reached up slowly, his fingers curling around the edges of his mask. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to pause, as if the simple act of him removing it would somehow alter the very atmosphere of the plane. He didn't rush. He wanted the moment to be deliberate, a decision made for himself, not a reaction to the uncomfortable silence around him. He wanted it to have weight. The mask came off. For the first time in hours, LeBron felt the cool air brush against his face. His eyes, now free from the dark lenses, scanned the cabin, settling briefly on Susan. Her eyes flicked to him. For a brief instant, there was a flash of recognition. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. She shifted her attention elsewhere, her movements hurried and unsure. LeBron didn't need to say anything. That moment of recognition, however fleeting, was enough. He was no longer just the faceless passenger. He was LeBron James, the man, the legend. And now the world would have to reckon with him, just as they had always reckoned with his public persona. Mr. Whitman, who had been completely oblivious to LeBron's identity until that moment, suddenly leaned forward, his eyes widening. It was subtle at first, but the change in his demeanor was unmistakable. The arrogant confidence he had carried before vanished. His eyes flicked nervously to LeBron and then away. He muttered something under his breath, clearly trying to process what was unfolding before him. LeBron let the silence hang for a moment, allowing everyone in the cabin to absorb the reality of the situation. It was clear that some people had already recognized him, but the question was, how would they react? Would they offer apologies? Would they be embarrassed? Or would they double down on the ignorance they had shown earlier? Susan, who had been chatting with another passenger further down the aisle, turned around sharply at the sound of a hushed gasp. Her eyes immediately locked onto LeBron. The recognition was instant, and her face flushed crimson. She froze, momentarily unsure of what to do or say. LeBron met her gaze with a calmness that surprised even him. He didn't want apologies. He didn't want to see pity in her eyes. What he wanted, what he needed, was something deeper. He needed her and every other passenger to understand the weight of what had just transpired. The actions of the crew, the indifference of the passengers. It wasn't just about ignoring a famous person. It was about failing to see the humanity of anyone who didn't fit the mold they had constructed in their minds. LeBron let the silence stretch. And in that silence, the truth hung heavy, impossible to ignore. For a beat too long, the silence stretched between them. When LeBron finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, looking directly at Susan. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the tray she held, a nervous energy radiating from her. At first, she didn't respond. The tension in the air thickened. Then, slowly, she nodded. still avoiding his eyes, still refusing to acknowledge the discomfort of the moment. LeBron leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady but not hostile. "It's not about who I am," he said, his voice measured, carrying the weight of everything that had been building up. "It's about how people like me are treated every day. It's about how we're seen, or more importantly, how we're not seen. You didn't even look at me until now, Susan. Why?" She shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, her face flushed. I'm sorry, I didn't." "I'm not asking for an apology," LeBron interrupted gently, his tone unwavering. "I just want you to understand, this isn't about me being famous. It's about respect. It's about dignity. You should treat everyone the same, no matter who they are. But when I walked onto this plane, I wasn't seen as a person. I was seen as an image, a stereotype, something to ignore or avoid." A long pause followed. For a brief moment, Susan seemed to struggle for words. Her expression shifted: shame, confusion, realization. The other passengers had taken notice. A few began murmuring amongst themselves, some shifting in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. Others sat wide-eyed, watching as the moment unfolded. LeBron held their attention. The man who had been invisible for the entire flight was now the center of the story. "I didn't recognize you at first," Susan admitted quietly, her voice tinged with regret. "But that's no excuse. I should have treated you with the same respect I give to everyone." LeBron nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. "That's all I'm asking for," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Respect. It shouldn't matter who I am or what I do. I deserve the same treatment as anyone else on this plane. That's all." He leaned back in his seat, his posture deliberate. He wasn't looking for confrontation. He wasn't here to argue. He wanted them to understand. He was not an object of curiosity. He was not someone to be dismissed. Yes, he was LeBron James. But more than that, he was a human being. The cabin fell into a heavy silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Some passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Others looked away, pretending not to notice. Mr. Whitman, who had spent most of the flight sneering, now sat stiffly beside him, his once smug expression replaced with clear embarrassment. And the flight attendants? They had stopped in their tracks, as if suddenly unsure of their next move. LeBron sat still, watching as the flight attendants and passengers processed what had just happened. The weight of the moment hung in the air. This wasn't a solution. Not yet. But it was something. A spark. A small, quiet act that could ignite something much larger. He hoped it would bring awareness to the daily acts of prejudice so many people faced. The quiet injustices that were easy to ignore until they were put on full display. As the plane descended toward its destination, LeBron couldn't help but wonder if this was a turning point. Not just for himself, but for the world around him. Real change, he knew, only happened when people were forced to confront the uncomfortable truths they preferred to look away from. Maybe, just maybe, this flight, this seemingly ordinary journey, was the perfect place for that confrontation to begin. The descent was quick, the turbulence light, but inside, LeBron's thoughts churned like a storm. As the wheels touched down and the plane began its slow roll toward the gate, silence filled the cabin. The awkward tension still lingered, thick and heavy. Even the steady hum of the engines couldn't drown it out. LeBron remained in his seat, his mind replaying everything that had happened over the past few hours. The discomfort, the silent judgments, the quiet but undeniable prejudice. He exhaled slowly. He had said what needed to be said. Now it was out there. As the plane taxied to the terminal, he pulled his phone from his pocket and unlocked it. His finger hovered over the screen, eyes locked on the video he had recorded during the flight. He had captured it. All the dismissiveness, the unspoken but clear bias, the moment Susan had finally been forced to face what she had done. The footage was raw and unfiltered. He wasn't sure how he felt about it yet, but one thing was clear: it was too important not to share. With a few taps, he uploaded the video to his Instagram and Twitter, The caption was simple: "We all deserve respect, no matter who we are. Watch closely." And just like that, the video was live. As the plane reached the gate and passengers began to gather their things, LeBron remained seated, fingers drumming lightly against the armrest as he refreshed the page. The comments started trickling in almost immediately. At first, there were just a handful of messages from close friends and longtime fans. But then, within minutes, the numbers exploded. By the time LeBron stood to exit the plane, the video had already gone viral. This wasn't just about his fans anymore. Everyone was talking about it. His post had been shared hundreds of thousands of times, and the views were skyrocketing by the second. LeBron could barely keep up with the flood of reactions. Some comments were supportive, commending him for his courage and for speaking out. Others were critical, accusing him of overreacting, of turning a small slight into a big deal. But the overwhelming majority were outraged. People were sharing their own stories of being ignored, dismissed, treated as if they didn't belong, all because of their skin color, their background, or the way they looked. The floodgates had opened. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. By the time LeBron stepped out of the airport, his phone was buzzing nonstop. News outlets were reaching out for interviews. Celebrities, athletes, and public figures were reposting the video, offering their support and calling for change in the way people were treated, especially in spaces meant to serve everyone equally. This wasn't just a moment. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Flights were continuing as usual, but the hashtag #AllPassengers had already started trending. It was clear that LeBron's message had resonated with people far beyond his usual audience. But amid the flood of reactions, one message stood out more than the rest. The head of the airline had posted a public apology. The statement acknowledged the situation, assured the public that an investigation was underway, and vowed that the company would re-examine and improve its internal training and policies. A new protocol would be implemented to ensure that all passengers were treated with respect and dignity. LeBron felt a wave of satisfaction. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The conversation had started, and more importantly, the world was listening. As the hours passed, the story continued to unfold. News anchors discussed the incident on television, debating its racial implications and the larger issue of prejudice in everyday life. Social media was ablaze with reactions, retweets, and passionate calls for change. People were sharing their own painful experiences, stories of discrimination, of being treated unfairly simply because of how they looked or where they came from. Some were compiling lists of similar incidents they had faced while traveling, drawing clear parallels between their struggles and what LeBron had endured on that flight. But for LeBron, this was never about the viral fame or the millions of views. It wasn't about making headlines. It was about what the video represented. It was about forcing people to confront the uncomfortable truth. It was about sharing a reality that too many people preferred to ignore. As he scrolled through the comments, he saw just how deep the issue ran. The people sharing their stories weren't just fellow athletes or celebrities. They were everyday people. Mothers, fathers, teachers, workers, students. Anyone who had ever been judged unfairly because of their appearance. LeBron had made them feel seen. And now, together, they were making their collective voices heard. The next morning, LeBron woke to find that the video had exploded even further overnight. Major media outlets were running stories on the incident, analyzing its implications. Talk shows and interviews featured discussions on discrimination, big and small, and how it shaped the daily experiences of so many people. The airline issued another statement, this time promising immediate changes to its service and operations. They publicly announced they were reaching out to LeBron to discuss what had happened and invited him to meet with their management team. LeBron knew this was just the beginning. The viral video had opened a door, but only a crack. The real work lay in changing the system, fixing the flaws that allowed these microaggressions to happen every day, unchecked. In the days that followed, LeBron began receiving invitations to speak at events, join panel discussions, and even advise companies on tackling implicit bias within their organizations. It was clear people were hungry for change, and now they had a voice to help drive it. But even as the world responded, LeBron knew the fight was far from over. The reactions were still mixed, the critics still loud, and the system still deeply flawed. This moment might have sparked a conversation, but it was only the first step. As LeBron sat at his kitchen table that morning, sipping coffee and scrolling through hundreds of messages of support, he understood. The real challenge was still ahead. This wasn't just about an apology from one airline. It wasn't about changing the way people treated him on a single flight. This was about changing the way the world saw him and others like him who didn't fit a certain mold. But LeBron wasn't afraid of the fight. He had faced far greater obstacles in his life, on the court, in his career, and in his personal journey, and had always emerged stronger. This, too, would become a part of his legacy, and he was ready to keep fighting for that change. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The world had heard his message, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had truly been seen. In the days following the release of the video, the backlash against the airline was swift and severe. The company's executives scrambled to contain the damage, but the social media storm LeBron had ignited showed no signs of slowing down. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just a fleeting controversy, it was a movement. The video was too powerful, too raw, and it had touched a nerve with the public. At first, the airline's PR team tried to downplay the situation, issuing a brief apology and promising an internal review. But as the story gained momentum, it became impossible to ignore. The hashtag #AllPassengers continued to trend for days, dominating news feeds, while major media outlets began dedicating entire segments to the issue of bias in the airline industry. This was no longer just about one flight attendant's behavior. This was about a larger systemic problem, one that had gone unchecked for far too long. The public was demanding accountability, and the airline had no choice but to respond. Within a week of the incident, the airline issued a new statement, one that went beyond empty apologies. They announced sweeping changes to their policies, including overhauling their training programs to focus on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and customer service standards. Launching a new initiative to ensure that all passengers, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic background, would receive equal treatment and respect. LeBron's video had made one thing undeniably clear. This wasn't just an isolated incident. The outrage wasn't just about a celebrity being mistreated. It was about how society had come to tolerate microaggressions and discrimination as the norm. People were fed up, and the airline knew they couldn't afford to ignore the public's demands. 1 week after the incident, LeBron received an invitation to meet with the airline's senior leadership. He accepted, but he was under no illusion that one meeting could fix everything. This wasn't about appeasing him. It was about real, lasting change. LeBron arrived at the airline's headquarters dressed casually, his demeanor calm but resolute. He wasn't there for a photo op. He was there to make sure this moment counted. Here's your rewritten content, keeping the original meaning intact while making it more engaging and consistent with American culture. LeBron James entered the sleek, modern boardroom on the top floor of the airline's headquarters. The atmosphere was tense. The executives were prepared to make amends, but they were also well aware of the storm they were facing. This wasn't just about damage control anymore. They were on the verge of losing public trust, and if they didn't handle the situation correctly, the consequences could be severe. LeBron took his seat at the large conference table, his presence commanding but his tone measured. He wasn't here to lecture. He was here to listen, to discuss, and most importantly, to ensure that the airline's commitment to change went beyond just a public relations gesture. The conversation began with the airline's CEO offering a formal apology. His tone was serious, his words carefully chosen as he acknowledged that the company had failed in its duty to treat all passengers with respect. LeBron listened attentively but remained silent, allowing the CEO to finish before speaking. "I want to make sure you truly understand something," LeBron said, his voice steady and firm. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person of color, every individual who doesn't fit a certain mold, and how they're treated every single day. There are countless people who experience this kind of prejudice, but they don't have a platform to speak out about it. By sharing my experience, I gave them a voice." The CEO nodded solemnly. "We understand, Mr. James, and we are committed to making real changes. We have already begun revising our training programs and are implementing mandatory workshops for all employees on racial bias and respectful customer service. In addition, we are establishing a new diversity and inclusion council within the company to ensure that we continue to move in the right direction." LeBron acknowledged their efforts, but he wasn't going to let them off the hook easily. He leaned forward, his expression unwavering. "We appreciate your words, but actions speak louder," he said. "You can promise change, but if it doesn't stick, if it doesn't become part of your company's DNA, then it's meaningless. This needs to be reflected in every aspect of your operations, not just in training sessions. It has to be in your hiring practices, in how you handle complaints, and in the way your employees interact with passengers every day." The CEO took notes, nodding in agreement. "We hear you. We are committed to taking those steps. We want to partner with you on this. We understand that this isn't just about making a statement. It's about creating a culture of respect from the top down. We want to work with you to ensure this never happens again." LeBron was cautiously optimistic. He knew that a few meetings and revised training protocols wouldn't fix the deep-rooted issues of racial discrimination in the airline industry, but this was a start. It was a chance to hold the industry accountable, and he wasn't about to back down now. He agreed to collaborate with the company on its new initiatives, but he made one thing clear. He wouldn't settle for empty promises. He expected measurable, lasting change. As the meeting wrapped up, LeBron stood and shook hands with the CEO and other executives. But before walking out the door, he turned back and said, "Make sure you do more than just talk about it. Hold yourselves accountable. Hold your employees accountable. The work you do here can have a ripple effect across the entire industry. Don't waste this opportunity." The CEO nodded. "We won't, Mr. James. Thank you for your time and for helping us see things differently." LeBron didn't say anything else as he walked out. The conversation had been productive, but he knew this was just the beginning. The real test would be in the follow-through, ensuring that the airline stuck to its promises and that other companies in the industry took notice. Meanwhile, the fallout from the incident continued to unfold. Susan, the flight attendant who had treated LeBron dismissively, had been placed on administrative leave while the company conducted an internal investigation. The airline publicly announced that they were reviewing her actions, but there was no immediate decision on what consequences she would face. Public opinion was divided. Some believed she should be fired for her blatant mistreatment of LeBron. Others argued that she was simply a symptom of a much larger systemic issue, and that firing her wouldn't address the deeper problem of implicit bias within the industry. Regardless of where people stood on Susan's fate, one thing was clear. The conversation had begun, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. A few days after the meeting with the airline, LeBron saw that Susan had issued a public apology. In an emotional statement, she admitted to her mistake and expressed deep regret for how she had treated him. She acknowledged that her actions had been influenced by biases she hadn't fully recognized until that moment. It was a hard lesson, but one she promised to learn from and use to do better moving forward. LeBron wasn't sure how he felt about the apology. He believed it was likely sincere, but he also knew that sincerity alone didn't erase what had happened. Still, he wasn't interested in seeing her punished further. His goal had always been to address the larger issue, the bias ingrained in the system, not to seek personal revenge. If Susan had truly learned from her mistake, that was enough. In the end, she was allowed to return to work, but with a formal warning. She was also required to complete the same training that the airline had rolled out for all employees. The company's decision to keep her on staff reflected the larger goal they had set. Not just punishing individuals, but reforming the entire system to prevent these incidents from happening again. However, public reaction was divided. Some believed she should have been fired, while others saw her as a symptom of a much bigger problem. There were growing calls for more accountability, not just for Susan, but for the industry as a whole. LeBron didn't have all the answers, but as the dust began to settle, he felt a sense of closure. He had done his part, but the work wasn't over. Now the real challenge was ensuring that the conversation didn't fade away. He would continue to speak out, hold companies accountable, and fight for a world where everyone, regardless of race or background, was treated with the dignity they deserved. The viral video had been the spark. Now the flame of change had been lit, and LeBron James wasn't going to let it go out. LeBron James' experience serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of awareness, respect, and standing up against bias in everyday life. His story teaches us that prejudice, whether subtle or overt, still exists and must be challenged. It's a lesson in humility that no matter who you are or what you've accomplished, unfair treatment can still find its way into your path. However, it also reinforces the value of using one's voice and platform to spark change. We should all strive to recognize our own biases and make conscious efforts to treat everyone with fairness and dignity. The way we interact with others, whether in a plane, workplace, or daily encounters, shapes the world around us. Change begins with acknowledging injustice and having the courage to address it, even when it's uncomfortable. LeBron's response wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. If we all take a stand for respect and equality, we can create a more just and inclusive society. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Share it with your friends. Maybe it will make someone think. Check out the other videos on our channel. There's more to come.